Unit 1, Lesson 6, The Civil Rights Movement, Part 1. Unit 1, Lesson 6, The Civil Rights Movement, Part 1. The essential question for today: how did minorities seek equality during the Civil Rights Movement? The Civil Rights Movement used the Reconstruction Amendments not only as a blueprint for action, but the ability to act freely. What was the Civil Rights Movement? It began as early as 1880, after the end of Reconstruction. It was the struggle for social justice and equality during the 1950s and 60s, and it used both violent direct intervention and nonviolent peaceful protests to accomplish its goals. First, we'll explore prominent civil rights groups, beginning with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, founded in 1909. It was a civil rights organization founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, Moorfield Story, and Ida B. Wells. Its purpose was to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons, and to eliminate racial hatred and racial discrimination. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, was founded in 1957 and led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was founded in Atlanta, Georgia, after the Montgomery bus boycott. They believed in nonviolent activism like protests, boycotts, and indirect action. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was founded in 1960, led by Mayor Marion Barry of Washington, D.C., Congressman John Lewis, and the NAACP Chairman Julian Bond. They advocated for racial equality, made popular during the sit-in movements of the 1960s, beginning in February of 1960 when 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat at a Woolworth's lunch counter and refused to get up. Woolworth was a segregated diner. This soon sparked a national outrage, with peaceful sit-ins spreading as a means of protest. The United Farm Workers Foundation was founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in 1962 to empower migrant farm workers. They sought better working conditions and higher wages. They used nonviolent protests and resistance, and led a boycott of the California Grapes Association from 1965 to 1970. They were a leader in union negotiations and practices throughout America, seeking higher wages, better working conditions, and fair employment practices for all migrant workers. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, founded in 1968 by George Mitchell, Dennis Banks, and Clyde Bellecourt. It began as a community activist movement. They sought autonomy over tribal areas, primarily regarding their economic independence, their protection of legal rights long guaranteed, the restoration of ancestral lands, and the revival of traditional culture. In November 1969, more than 200 Native Americans took over the abandoned federal prison on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. For 19 months, Indian activists occupied the island to draw attention to conditions on the nation's Indian reservations. Alcatraz, the Native Americans said, symbolized conditions on reservations. It has no running water, it has inadequate sanitation facilities, there is no industry, and so unemployment is very great. There are no healthcare facilities, the soil is rocky and unproductive. The activists, who called themselves Indians of all tribes, offered to buy Alcatraz from the federal government for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, symbolizing the exploitation of their ancestors years ago by early American settlers. The Asian American Movement, or AAM, in the 1960s was founded to combat racial injustice, radicalized by anti-Vietnam War protests and Black Power. They sought better working conditions and higher wages, and sought to end the strict arrival or entrance quotas for immigrants from Asian countries, where no limitations were placed on immigrants from European countries. They originally included citizens from Japan, China, and the Philippines, though they expanded to represent citizens from Korea, the Pacific Islands, Southeast and South Asians, in a continued struggle and fight against being labeled a model minority and the stigma attached to it. The Nation of Islam was founded in 1930 by Wallace Fard Muhammad in Detroit, Michigan. Its aim was to promote Islam within the Black community. They were a vocal advocate for Black empowerment, later led by Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam has over 50,000 members. One of their most prominent members was American boxer, Olympian, champion, and outspoken civil rights activist and leader Muhammad Ali. The Black Panther Party was founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California, 1966. They advocated for Black nationalism, socialism, and armed self-defense. Their main struggle was a fight to end police brutality of colored people. They created a free lunch program and offered free legal counsel and advice to any citizen who sought it out. They were cited by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover as the greatest threat to U.S. security. Prominent civil rights leaders. Rosa Parks was considered the mother of the civil rights movement. She was arrested December 1st, 1955, after a refusal to give up her seat on a bus. She was sitting in the back of the bus in the all-colored section, and when the white front section of the bus was full and a white man needed a seat, Rosa Parks and other African American citizens were demanding they keep their seats, as the bus driver tried to make room for the white man passenger. This led to the Montgomery bus boycott, where 17,000 Black citizens boycotted public transportation. It lasted for over a year and brought about federal changes desegregating public transportation. Rosa Parks was a nonviolent activist who led a movement that created substantial change. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was considered the leader of the civil rights movement, and especially the leader of the nonviolent part of the movement. He led the movement to end segregation and counter prejudice, primarily by peaceful means and peaceful protests. He was an incredibly powerful speaker that transformed the sentiment of the public, both whites and blacks, and began to humanize the civil rights movement and the fight for equality. He helped pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And his march on Washington in the summer of 1965 had over 200,000 people joining him. Cesar Chavez dropped out of school after 8th grade and began working in the fields full-time. In 1946, he joined the United States Navy, serving for 2 years in a segregated unit. After his service was over, he returned to farm work and married Helen Favela, with whom he would eventually have 8 children. In 1952, Chavez was working at a lumberyard in San Jose when he became a grassroots organizer for the Community Service Organization, or CSO, a Latino civil rights group. Chavez would use this experience to found the National Farm Workers Association in 1962, using his entire life's savings. In September 1965, the National Farm Workers Association launched a strike against California's grape growers, alongside the Agricultural Workers Organization Committee, AWOC, a Filipino-American labor group. The strike lasted 5 years and expanded into a nationwide boycott of California grapes. The boycott drew widespread support thanks to the highly visible campaign headed by Chavez, who led a 340-mile march from Delano to Sacramento at the state capitol in 1966, and undertook a well-publicized 25-day hunger strike in 1968. Chavez would be noted as saying, "I am convinced that the truest act of courage, the strongest act of manliness, is to sacrifice ourselves for others in a totally nonviolent struggle for justice. To be a man is to suffer for others. God helps us be men." Malcolm X was a prominent civil rights leader and spokesman for the Nation of Islam. He promoted Islam as a religion within the Black community and was a vocal advocate for Black empowerment, believing in Black nationalism and that African Americans must protect themselves by any means necessary, including using violence as a means of protection and determination. Huey P. Newton was an African American revolutionary, founder of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense with Bobby Seale in Oakland in 1966. He believed in Black nationalism, socialism, and armed self-defense, just like Malcolm X. He was wrongfully arrested for shooting a police officer, was arrested by the FBI, and assassinated at the age of 47 in 1989. Some events to summarize the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, beginning with the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1955, Rosa Parks, a local NAACP member, refused to give her seat to white riders. The resulting Montgomery bus boycott led to a Supreme Court ruling that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was made up of African Americans to protest activities taking place all across the South. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the elected leader of this group, which was committed to mass nonviolent action across the South. When Rosa Parks was arrested, the NAACP called for a one-day boycott of the city bus system. Community leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association and elected Martin Luther King Jr. as its leader. African Americans continued to boycott the bus system for a year, which not only hurt the bus system, but hurt other white businesses. After the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional, integration of the buses moved forward, though not evenly paced throughout the South. The civil rights workers that used several direct nonviolent methods and indirect nonviolent methods to confront discrimination and racism in the late 1950s and early 1960s, including boycotts, sit-ins, and freedom rides. Many of these nonviolent tactics were based on those of Mohandas Gandhi, a leader in India's struggle for independence from Great Britain. American civil rights leaders such as James Farmer of CORE, Martin Luther King Jr. of SCLC, Cesar Chavez of United Farm Workers Foundation, and others shared Mahatma Gandhi's views. James Lawson, a prominent African-American minister, conducted workshops on nonviolent methods in Nashville and on college campuses. The strategies of nonviolence were effective and powerful. The sit-in movement, for example, where 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina stayed in their seats at a Woolworth's lunch counter after being refused service because of their race, led to, over the next few days, protesters filling 63 of the 66 counter seats at the lunch counter. Those students were dedicated and well behaved and ended each sit-in with a prayer. Over time, protesters in 50 southern cities began to use the peaceful sit-in tactic. And the Freedom Riders throughout the 1960s were a powerful nonviolent protest strategy. In 1960, the Supreme Court ordered that bus facilities for interstate travelers must be open to all passengers. Or sent a group of Freedom Riders on a bus trip through the South to draw attention to the situation. Mobs angry at the Freedom Riders attempted to use white-only facilities, firebombed a bus in Anniston, Alabama, and attacked riders with baseball bats and metal pipes in Birmingham. Peaceful protests and nonviolent protest measures helped lead to the Voting Rights Act. The Selma campaign, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. organized marches in Selma, Alabama, to gain voting rights for African Americans. Dr. King and many other marchers were jailed, wrongfully, and police attacked a march in Marion, Georgia. Dr. King announced a 4-day march from Selma to Montgomery. The Selma March, where 600 African Americans began the 54-mile march, were faced with city and state police blockading their way out of Selma. TV cameras captured the police using clubs, chains, and electric cattle prods on the peaceful protesters and marchers. This led President Lyndon Baines Johnson to ask for and receive a tough voting rights law, establishing the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and it passed through Congress with large majorities. This proved to be one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed, ensuring equal opportunities for all citizens to vote without fear of intimidation or retaliation. Expanding the movement beyond the United States South. The conditions outside of the South, where most African Americans lived, were that African Americans were kept in all black parts of town because they were unwelcome in white neighborhoods, similar to how they took over the Harlem neighborhood and led the Harlem Renaissance in Harlem, New York. African Americans faced discrimination in banking, which made home ownership and home and neighborhood improvements extremely difficult. And they faced discrimination in employment opportunities, where there was a high unemployment rate and stagnant poverty throughout. This created a situation of urban unrest, where there was frustrations over the urban conditions and it exploded into violence, most notably with the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965, which lasted for over 6 days, and the Detroit riots in 1967, which also lasted for about a week. President Lyndon Baines Johnson appointed the Kerner Commission to study the causes of urban rioting. They primarily placed the blame on poverty and continuing discrimination. As the years drew on and little to no change was happening that would appease or appeal to the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, and the Nation of Islam and Black Muslims, there began to be fractures in the movement. Stokely Carmichael became head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they abandoned the philosophy of nonviolence. Black Power became the new rallying cry where they wanted African Americans to depend themselves to solve the problems and protect and arm themselves. This is a movement that was shared by the Black Panther Party. They called for violent revolution as a means of African American liberation, where members openly carried guns and monitored African American neighborhoods to guard against police brutality, echoing the sentiments of Black Muslims in the Nation of Islam, who also had a message of Black nationalism and self-discipline, but more importantly, self-reliance, where Malcolm X offered messages of hope, defiance, and Black pride in the face of white oppression. All the violence incited and welcomed by the Black Power movement led to the decline of Black Power. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was especially concerned about the Black Panthers, where police raided Black Panther headquarters in many cities throughout the 1960s, and armed conflict resulted, even when Black Panther members were unarmed. By the early 1970s, armed violence had led to the killing or arrest of many of the Black Panther members, especially the party leaders. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee collapsed with the help of the FBI. H. Rap Brown, the leader who replaced Stokely Carmichael as the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was encouraged to take radical and shocking positions. Brown was encouraged to take these positions by his staff, many of whom worked undercover for the FBI. This visual summary of the civil rights movement is in your inbox on Google Classroom and does not need to be copied down. In your notebooks, take a few minutes and answer the question: how did minorities seek equality during the civil rights movement?